The moment Frances Beckett stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, a man on horseback nearly ran her straight into the ground, and if not for the quick hands of a dusty, broad-shouldered cowboy who yanked her sideways by the arm, she would have met her end on the very first day of her new life. She stumbled against a solid chest, caught the scent of leather and wood smoke, and looked up into a pair of green eyes so startlingly clear against the sun-weathered skin of the man's face that she forgot, for just a moment, to be furious. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and steady, still holding her by both arms as though she might bolt or crumple at any second. Frances straightened, tugged herself free, and pressed her traveling hat back onto her dark hair with as much dignity as a woman covered in road dust could manage. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she said, and then, because she was honest almost to a fault, she added, "That is, I will be once my heart decides to beat at a normal pace again." The corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, something careful. "Dexter Thatcher," he said, and held out a calloused hand. Frances Beckett, she shook it. His grip was firm but not crushing, the kind of handshake that told you a man had nothing to prove. "I have just arrived from St. Louis. I am here to take the schoolteacher position at the Dusty Creek schoolhouse." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. "That's so," he said, and he looked at her with new attention, measuring and curious. "The town's been waiting on a teacher for better part of 6 months. Kids have been running wild." "Then I had better get to work," Frances said, picking up her traveling bag from where it had spilled into the dirt. She looked around at the main street of Dusty Creek, a bakery, a dry goods store, a saloon with its doors already open and noise spilling out into the morning air, a sheriff's office with a cracked window, a livery stable, and beyond it all, the wide, flat Texas plain stretching away into forever under a sky so blue it made her chest ache. She had grown up in St. Louis. She had never seen so much sky in her life. "I can walk you to the boarding house," Dexter offered. "Mrs. Calloway's." "It's just up the way. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," he said, and picked up the second of her 2 bags without asking permission. She looked at him sideways as they walked. He was tall, somewhere in the middle of his 20s she guessed, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck beneath the brim of his hat, and the easy, unhurried walk of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. There were scars on the back of his right hand, old ones, long-heeled to silver lines. His boots were good quality but worn down, the kind of boots a man walked miles in rather than wore to impress people. "What is it you do in Dusty Creek, Mr. Thatcher?" she asked. "I run cattle," he said. "Got a spread about 4 miles east of town, not big enough." "You live alone out there?" He glanced at her. "I do, have done for 2 years since my father passed." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "He built the ranch. I'm still building it, I suppose." Frances nodded. She understood that kind of work, the kind where you inherit something half-finished and have to figure out what to do with the rest of it. Her own mother had died when she was 14, leaving Frances with 2 younger brothers to help raise and a father who had retreated so deeply into grief it was practically a second address. She had learned early that life required you to simply keep moving, even when you were not entirely sure of the direction. Mrs. Calloway turned out to be a stout, cheerful woman of about 50 with ginger-going gray hair and a habit of talking in 3 directions at once, who welcomed Frances with a cup of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint, and a room upstairs with a window that looked out over the back garden, and beyond that, the open land. Dexter set her bags down inside the front door and said goodbye with a tip of his hat and nothing more. Frances watched him walk back down the dusty street and told herself firmly that she had not come all the way from St. Louis to moon over the first handsome man she stumbled into. Literally stumbled into. She had come to teach. The schoolhouse was a small building at the eastern edge of town, 1 room, with 8 long benches, a blackboard that had seen better decades, and a stove in the corner that would be essential in winter, but was already producing an impressive amount of ambient heat in the April warmth. There were 17 children registered, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they arrived the next morning with the collective energy of a thunderstorm in a bottle. Frances discovered in those first hours that teaching was less about knowing things and more about knowing people. She could teach every subject in the curriculum backwards and forwards. She had spent 4 years at the St. Louis Ladies' Academy before taking her teaching certificate, but what she had to learn quickly was which child needed encouragement and which needed boundaries and which, like young Billy Hartley who sat in the back row and drew horses in the margins of everything, needed to be told that his drawings were good enough to be worth putting in a proper sketchbook. She found her rhythm within the week. What she did not find was any kind of quiet, because Dusty Creek, it turned out, was not a quiet town. The trouble began, as trouble often did in that part of Texas in 1878, with land. The cattle land east of town had been under dispute for months before Frances arrived, a slow-burning disagreement between the larger ranchers and the smaller operations that had the potential to turn into something far uglier than argument. She heard about it in fragments, from Mrs. Calloway over breakfast, from the fathers of her students who lingered to speak to her after school, from the general ambient conversation that filled the dry goods store whenever she went in to buy chalk and paper. The man at the center of it was called Harlan Briggs, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He was buying up land, legally where he could and through pressure where he could not, and the smaller ranchers were feeling the squeeze. Dexter Thatcher was one of them. Frances learned this not from Dexter himself but from his neighbor, a weathered older rancher named George Prout, who stopped to talk to her outside the dry goods store on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after she had arrived. Young Thatcher's holding firm, George told her, in the manner of a man sharing news that worried him. But Briggs sent men over to his fence line last week, cut wire. Thatcher found 3 of his cattle wandered into the next county. He shook his head. Boys got more stubbornness than sense sometimes, which I mean as a compliment. He should speak to the sheriff, Frances said. George Prout gave her a look that was not unkind but was very tired. Sheriff Morrison takes his orders from whoever's paying the most in taxes, Miss Beckett, and right now, that's Harlan Briggs. Frances had heard this kind of story before, in different forms, in different contexts. The powerful pressing on the smaller until the smaller either bent or broke. She had come west to start fresh, but some things did not change with geography. She saw Dexter that same evening. She had walked to the edge of town to clear her head after a long day, following the road east as the sun dropped low and turned the whole world amber and rose, and she nearly walked straight into his horse for the second time, which made him laugh, a real laugh this time, surprised out of him, and made her smile despite herself. He dismounted and walked with her a little way, leading the horse, and she told him what George Prout had said, not to repeat gossip, but because she thought he should know people were talking about him with concern. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. The evening air smelled of dry grass and something faintly sweet, the tiny yellow wildflowers that grew along the roadside that she had not yet learned the name of. "People worry too much," he said at last. "Do you?" she asked. "Worry too much?" He looked at her sideways. "I worry the right amount." "And what does that look like exactly?" "Like fixing your fence wire at 5 in the morning and keeping a close eye on your herd and not picking fights you don't need to pick," he said. "And being careful about which fights you do pick." "That sounds less like not worrying and more like worrying very practically," Frances said, another almost smile. He was maddeningly sparing with them, she had noticed, which meant that when they appeared they had weight. "Maybe," he said. They walked until the light was nearly gone and then turned back toward town, and he rode alongside her at a walk until she was back at Mrs. Calloway's, and he said good night and rode away. And Frances stood on the front step and watched him go and told herself again, with somewhat less conviction than the first time, that she had not come to Texas to fall in love with a struggling cattle rancher with fence-cutting enemies and eyes the color of creek water in sunlight. But the trouble with telling yourself something firmly is that it tends to have no effect whatsoever on how you actually feel. May came in warm and golden, and Dusty Creek settled into its rhythms around her. She knew her students now, really knew them, their names and their families and what made each of them light up or shut down. She knew that Clara Prout, George's granddaughter, would read anything you put in front of her and needed harder books. She knew that Tommy Briggs, Harlan Briggs's youngest boy, was desperately lonely beneath his bravado and acted out when he felt invisible. She treated him the same as any other child, which she suspected was more than he got at home, and watched his behavior improve slowly and steadily like a plant finding light. She knew Mrs. Calloway's coffee, and the way the town smelled before rain, and which floorboards in the schoolhouse creaked, and she was beginning to know Dexter Thatcher. He had a habit of appearing. Not intrusively, not insistently, but consistently. He would come by the schoolhouse on his way through town and stop to ask how she was getting on. He would find himself in the dry goods store at the same time she was there, buying supplies for the ranch, and they would talk while waiting to be served. On Sunday evenings, after the brief church service that half the town attended and the other half observed from a safe distance, he would sometimes join the group that gathered in the town square, and he would find his way to wherever she was standing. She did not think he was doing it consciously. That was what made it interesting. "You know," said Mrs. Calloway one morning over coffee, in the tone of a woman who had observed much and was now prepared to comment on it, "that Dexter Thatcher is a good man. Has been since he was a boy. His father was a hard man, not unkind, but hard, and Dexter grew up understanding that things worth having take work." Frances said neutrally, "He seems capable." Mrs. Calloway looked at her with the benevolent patience of a woman who had weathered a great many neutral responses in her time. "He hasn't shown interest in a woman since a girl from Abilene turned him down 3 years ago. Before you start asking why, I'll tell you it's because he takes things seriously, and he doesn't see the point in starting something he can't finish." Frances put down her coffee cup. "Mrs. Calloway." "I'm just talking," the older woman said serenely, and refilled both their cups. The crisis that changed things between them came in the second week of May, and it came at the schoolhouse. Frances had stayed late to mark papers, and she was alone in the building when she heard the sound of something, voices, loud outside. She went to the window and saw 3 men she did not recognize standing in the road, and they were not townspeople. Their horses were trail dusty and hard-ridden, and the men themselves had the look of men being paid to do something unpleasant. She stepped outside and asked them clearly and without wavering what they wanted. The tallest of the 3, a man with a long red scar on his jaw, said they were looking for the Thatcher place. "I am not in the habit of giving directions to men I don't know," Frances said, "and I'd appreciate you moving along." The man with the scar looked at her with something between amusement and irritation. "You the schoolteacher?" "I am." "Then you ought to know when to keep your business to yourself, schoolteacher." "And you ought to know," Frances said, keeping her voice steady through the effort of will it required, "that the sheriff's office is 40 yards up that road and I have a very good set of lungs." They moved on, but she shook for a full 10 minutes after they were gone, sitting on the schoolhouse steps with her hands in her lap. She was still sitting there when Dexter rode up 20 minutes later, coming in from the direction the men had gone. He pulled up and looked at her. He was good at reading things. She had noticed that about him, the way he took in a situation before speaking. "You're white as a sheet," he said, and dismounted in one smooth motion. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing about him she had noticed, and when she was finished his expression had gone still in a way that told her he was managing something underneath it. "They were Briggs's men," he said. "I recognized one of them. They've been surveying the fence lines." He sat down on the step beside her, which he had not done before, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him after a day in the sun. "I'm sorry they came here. You shouldn't have had to deal with that." "I can deal with things," Frances said, and it came out more sharply than she intended because she was still shaking and it made her angry at herself. "I know you can," he said, and it was said simply, without any condescension at all, which was unusual enough that she looked at him directly. "I've been watching you deal with things for a month. You walked into this town knowing nobody and you've made it work. That's not nothing." She did not know what to say to that. Most of the men in her life, even the kind ones, had never said anything like it. Her father had loved her but thought of her primarily as capable and left it at that. The men in St. Louis had been interested in her, but not in any way that suggested they had actually paid attention to who she was. "You've been watching me," she said, and it came out differently than she intended it, softer. He held her gaze. "I have," he said, steady, honest. Uncomfortable with it, she could see that, but honest anyway. The shaking had stopped sometime in the last few minutes. She became aware of the evening air, the chorus of insects starting up in the dry grass, the last streak of orange along the horizon. "Your fence situation," she said, because she needed to be practical and she needed to talk about something other than the way he was looking at her. "Is it going to get worse?" "Probably," he said. "Briggs wants my land. It sits between two of his grazing sections and cuts him off from the creek access. If he had it, he'd control water for half the county. And you won't sell." "My father is buried on that land," Dexter said. "So no." She understood that completely. "Then what are you going to do?" He was quiet a moment. "I've written to the county land office," he said. "Put the property boundaries officially on record." It takes time, but it makes it harder for him to claim any kind of encroachment. "And I'm talking to the other ranchers he's been pressuring. If we can present a united complaint to the territorial authority in Austin, there's a chance something gets done about it." "That's smart," she said. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," she said. "I'm relieved. A lot of men in your situation would reach for a rifle." "That's the fastest way to lose everything," he said, "including your life." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I don't think about it, but my father spent 20 years building that place. I'm not going to throw it away in a day of bad judgment." She looked at him for a long moment in the fading light. He was looking out at the road now, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. There was something very solitary about him. Not lonely exactly, but alone in a way that looked like it had gone on a long time. "Would you like to have supper at Mrs. Calloway's?" she asked. "She always makes too much and she would like the company." He turned to look at her, and this time the almost smile went all the way. "Yes," he said, "I would, Mrs. Calloway made pot roast with potatoes and served it with fresh bread, and a look of absolute satisfaction that she kept almost completely off her face. And they sat at the big table in her dining room while the evening light faded through the lace curtains and talked for 2 hours. They talked about his ranch and her schoolhouse, and about St. Louis, which he had never seen, and about Texas, which she was still learning. He told her about the way the land looked in winter, silver and sharp-edged, and the way the cattle moved in cold weather, and what it was like to be out on the range at dawn when everything was still. She told him about her brothers, James and Will, back in Missouri, James now working in a print shop and Will still at school, and about her mother who had loved books and passed it on like a genetic trait. She told him about the reason she had decided to come west, which she had not told anyone else in Dusty Creek, not even Mrs. Calloway, the sense that she was waiting for her life in St. Louis, that the life she was living was a preparation for something, a pencil sketch rather than the finished thing, and that the teaching position in Texas had looked, when she read the posting, like a doorway. He listened to all of it with his full attention, which was the thing she was coming to value most about him. When he left that night, he paused in the doorway and said quietly, "I'm glad you came through that door." She stood in the hallway after he closed the front door behind him and pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the calm clarity of a woman recognizing something inevitable, that she was absolutely in love with Dexter Thatcher and had been for at least 2 weeks. The question was what to do about it. She was a practical woman. She believed in naming things. But she also knew that what she felt was new and fragile in the way that new true things sometimes are, before they set and harden and become permanent, and she was careful with it, the way she was careful with the first shoots of anything growing. June arrived and the land turned the deep particular green of Texas summer before the heat bleached it out again. And Frances Beckett and Dexter Thatcher were seen together often enough in Dusty Creek that people stopped remarking on it and simply accepted it as part of the landscape. They walked on Sunday evenings along the Eastern Road. He taught her to identify the stars he navigated by on long cattle drives, the practical stars, he called them, as opposed to the romantic ones, though she pointed out the distinction was more about attitude than astronomy. She read to him on the evenings he came to Mrs. Calloway's, from the novels she had brought in her trunk, and he listened with the same focused attention he gave everything, asking questions that made her think about what she had always assumed she knew. The land dispute simmered. The letter to the county office was acknowledged. A territorial authority representative was promised for August, which felt distant and insufficient in June when Briggs's men were still riding the fence lines, and the wire was still being cut. Dexter repaired it each time without confrontation. Frances admired the discipline of it while privately suspecting it was costing him something. One afternoon in late June, he brought her out to the ranch. He asked formally, with a kind of deliberateness that told her he had thought about it, whether she would like to see the place. She said yes without hesitating, and they rode out in his wagon. She was learning to ride, but had not graduated to confident horsemanship, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the kind of deep blue that seems painted. The ranch was modest in size but evident in care. The fences were well maintained everywhere that Briggs's men had not cut them. The barn was solid and well organized. The cattle were healthy-looking, a mixed herd, and he knew each section of his land the way she was learning to know each of her students, with specific knowledge of character and particular attention to what needed watching. He showed her where his father was buried, under a cottonwood tree near the western fence line, with a simple stone marker that had his name and dates and nothing else. He was a man who believed in doing things right, Dexter said. Not always a warm man, but a fair one. I try to be both. He said it simply, without either apology or excessive weight. I think you are, Frances said. He looked at her for a moment and then away, which was becoming a habit of his, this looking and then looking away, as though whatever he saw when he looked at her required some managing. She found it endearing and also slightly maddening. They ate lunch in the shade of the cottonwood tree, the bread and cheese and cold chicken she had packed that morning, and the conversation moved through half a dozen topics with the ease of two people who had discovered that they were genuinely interested in what the other thinks about everything. At one point, they were discussing the territorial school board's new requirements for curriculum, and at another they were debating whether the United States government's treatment of the Comanche people, who had been in this part of Texas for generations before the cattle ranchers arrived, was more accurately described as systematic or catastrophic, with Frances arguing it was both and neither word being sufficient. My father said the land was empty when he came, Dexter said, with an honesty that cost him something because she could hear it costing him. But it wasn't. It was being used, just not in the way he was accustomed to understanding. The Comanche knew this land better than any of us, and what happened to them? He stopped. He turned his hat over in his hands. It wasn't right. That's not a thing that was done right. She looked at him. Most men in this part of the country would not say that. Most men in this part of the country are wrong about a good many things, he said quietly. She reached over and put her hand over his briefly, and he turned his palm up and held her hand, and neither of them said anything, and the cottonwood tree rustled above his father's grave, and the cattle moved slow and calm in the distance, and Frances thought that she had never in her life felt so completely in the right place. He drove her back to town in the early evening, and when they pulled up in front of Mrs. Calloway's, he helped her down from the wagon seat, and he held her hand rather longer than was strictly necessary for the purposes of stepping down from a wagon, and they stood in the last golden light of a June day looking at each other. Frances, he said, in a voice that was lower and more careful than usual. Yes, she said. He stopped, started again. I am not good at saying things directly when they matter. You're better at it than you think, she said. He looked at her with those green eyes that she had been thinking about more or less constantly for 6 weeks. I would like to court you, he said, properly, if that's something you'd want. She had been waiting for it half-consciously for weeks, and still, hearing it said plainly in his plain voice, her heart did something that no amount of practicality or self-instruction had been able to prevent. Yes, she said, it is. The smile that followed was the fullest one she had seen from him yet, and it rearranged his whole face and made him look younger and easier, and she wanted to see it again every day for the rest of her life, which was such a decisive thought for a woman who had been in Texas for 2 months that it surprised even her. He went home. She went inside. Mrs. Calloway looked up from her sewing and read the whole situation in Frances's face in approximately 3 seconds and said, "Well then," with enormous satisfaction. Courtship in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878 meant that Dexter came to Sunday supper at Mrs. Calloway's and walked with her in the evenings and brought her wildflowers. Not the store-bought kind, but the ones he picked along the road to the ranch. Those small yellow ones she had wondered about, which he told her were called buffalo burr, and whose name she decided she was going to accept regardless of whether it was technically accurate. It meant letters because they were both readers and writers, and there was a particular intimacy to letters that conversation sometimes skipped over, and she saved every one of his. It also meant that the situation with Harlan Briggs became increasingly difficult to ignore. In mid-July, Briggs himself came to town. Frances saw him from the schoolhouse window, a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the expression of someone who had not been told no very often and had not developed a taste for it. He went to the sheriff's office first, and then to the bank, and then he walked the length of the main street as though measuring it for ownership, and the people who saw him treated him with the particular careful courtesy of people who are also afraid. That evening, Dexter told her that Briggs had made another offer for his land. A larger one this time, enough money to buy a different property elsewhere and still have something left. Briggs had sent the offer through the bank formally, which meant it was on record and could not be ignored. "What will you do?" Frances asked. They were sitting on the front steps of Mrs. Calloway's house because the evening was too warm to be inside and the town had quieted to its nighttime self, the saloon noise a background thing, the stars coming out one by one above the dark rooftops. "I've already declined it," Dexter said. "Also formally, also through the bank." She looked at him. "He won't like that." "No," he agreed. "Things may get harder. They may." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that whatever happens with this, I am not going to, that it does not change anything. What I mean is, this thing between you and me is not contingent on whether you win." He turned his head and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something stripped back and very direct. "That's not a small thing to say." "I know it isn't, I mean it." He reached over and took her hand the same way she had taken his under the cottonwood tree and held it. "I'm going to fight for it," he said. "The ranch. I'm not going to make it easy for him, but I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm not going to do anything stupid. I'm not going to give him an excuse to make this violent. My father worked too hard and too long for me to throw it away in anger." "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." The word was out before she caught it, and she felt the shift in the air immediately, the way the whole evening seemed to lean forward on its axis. She did not take it back. He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Say that again." She turned to look at him fully. The stars were out properly now, those practical stars he had taught her, and in their light his face was serious and open in a way it was not usually, every guard down. "I love you," she said. "I have for some time, if I'm being honest." He let out a long, slow breath, and then he reached up and touched her face, the side of her jaw with the back of his fingers very gently, the way you touch something you have been wanting to touch and have been making yourself wait. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said, because yes seemed to be the right answer to everything he said tonight. He kissed her. It was a careful kiss, deliberate, warm, tasting of the coffee they had drunk earlier, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to before he rested his forehead against hers and said, very quietly, in a voice that was entirely different from his usual measured tone, "I love you too. Lord help me, I think I have since you nearly got yourself run down in the street on the day you arrived." She laughed, properly laughed, and he did too, and Mrs. Calloway, who had been observing from behind the lace curtain of the front parlor, said to herself with great satisfaction, "There it is," and went to put the kettle on. July turned toward August and Dusty Creek baked in the deep Texas heat, and Frances and Dexter were in love with the full committed force of two people who had both waited for the right thing rather than settling for easier ones. He came to town most days now, not just Sundays. She went out to the ranch on Saturday mornings and learned the names of the cattle by section, and watched him work with the patient expertise of a man who had grown up doing this. And she brought books for his evenings, and he brought her coffee made on the range stove that was strong enough to consider a structural element. And she drank it, and refused to admit it nearly took the top of her head off. The August visit from the Territorial Authority representative arrived on the third day of the month. His name was Mr. Alderson, a thin, precise man from Austin who wore a suit that was remarkably unsuited to the Texas summer, and had the manner of someone who was used to resolving disputes through paperwork and found the emotional content of them inconvenient. He heard from the ranchers who had complaints against Briggs, 5 of them, including Dexter, all of whom had documented evidence of fence tampering, grazing encroachment, and in 2 cases, missing cattle, and he made notes in a small leather-bound book with the expression of a man who had heard this kind of story before. Frances attended the meeting not as a party to the dispute, but because George Pruitt's granddaughter Clara, who was one of her students, asked her to come and be there, with the complete faith of a 10-year-old that Miss Beckett's presence made difficult things go better. Frances came and sat in the back of the meeting room at the saloon, which was the only room large enough to hold everyone, and listened and said nothing unless asked, which she was not, but Dexter caught her eye across the room more than once, and something settled in him visibly when he did. Mr. Alderson's conclusion, delivered 3 days later, was cautious but real. The fence tampering was documented sufficiently to warrant a formal warning to Briggs's operation, and the land boundaries as recorded at the county office Dexter's paperwork, filed months ago, were confirmed to be legally binding. The encroachments would need to stop or the matter would proceed to the territorial court. It was not a total victory. Briggs was warned, not stopped. The pressure could continue in subtler forms, but it was something. That night, Dexter came to Mrs. Calloway's and sat at the big dining table and looked at Frances across it with a quietly radiant expression that she had never seen before on anyone's face, the expression of someone who has held something tightly for so long that being able to relax the grip is almost disorienting. "He's not going to risk a court fight," Dexter said. "He knows the documentation is too solid. It was always about intimidation. Now that the authorities seen it formally, the intimidation has less power." "You planned that," Frances said. "The paperwork, the letters, getting it all on official record before the meeting. You planned it from the beginning." "From the day they first cut my fence," he said. "I knew a rifle wasn't the answer. It never is, but paperwork can be armor if you build it right." She looked at him and felt again the profound rightness of him, the way his mind worked, the patience and the quiet intelligence of it. "You are a remarkable man," she said simply, without decoration. He looked at the table and then at her and said nothing, but his expression said everything. Mrs. Calloway set down a pie she had made in honor of the occasion, a peach pie, because she had declared that there would be pie, and then tactfully found urgent business in the kitchen and left them the dining room to themselves. He proposed to her that night. He did not make a production of it. He did not get down on one knee. He was not a theatrical man, and she would not have wanted theatrical. It would have felt like someone else's story. He simply said, when they were sitting together at the end of the evening, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He said it directly, as he said important things when he could make himself say them at all, and he said that he knew it had only been 4 months, which was not a very long time, but that he felt more certain about this than he had felt about anything except the land, and that he was asking her, not telling her, because everything about what was between them had been a choice freely made on both sides, and he wanted this to be the same. She said yes. She had been saying yes to him in one form or another since the evening on Mrs. Calloway's front steps when she first used the word love, and this was simply the most significant of those yesies. He put his hand over hers, both of them sitting quietly in the warm kitchen light, and they sat together for a while without speaking, in the way of two people who have found that they are comfortable with silence, because what is between them does not require constant noise to stay real. August moved into September and the heat began to ease by degrees. Frances wrote to her brothers in St. Louis. James wrote back immediately, warm and enthusiastic, asking when he could come to the wedding. Will, who was 17 and thought everything in Texas sounded impossibly romantic, wrote a 4-page letter that she read aloud to Dexter, and that made him laugh more completely than she had ever heard him laugh. The wedding was planned for October, when the weather would be manageable and the ranch would be past the busiest part of the cattle season. Frances would continue teaching. The town needed a teacher, and she loved teaching, and she was not inclined to give up either of those things for convention's sake, and Dexter had not once suggested she should. "I married you for who you are," he said when she raised the subject, in a tone that suggested this was obvious and she could stop worrying about it. "You haven't married me yet," she pointed out. "Give me 3 more weeks," he said. There was one more difficulty before October arrived, which Frances might have predicted if she had been inclined toward pessimism, which she was not. Harlan Briggs, finding his larger tactics no longer workable, tried a smaller and nastier one. He had, apparently, influence with certain members of the school board, and a complaint was lodged against Frances with the county superintendent, alleging that she was an unsuitable teacher on the grounds that she was engaged to a man who had been involved in a public land dispute. The logic was tortured and the real purpose was transparent to anyone who looked at it, but the superintendent sent a letter requiring a response, and Frances had to write a formal defense of her professional conduct and character. She wrote it herself, at the kitchen table in Mrs. Calloway's house, and Dexter sat across from her while she wrote, not interfering but present, and when she finished he read it and said it was the best piece of writing he had ever read, which she suspected was not strictly true but appreciated deeply anyway. The superintendent, to his credit, dismissed the complaint within a fortnight. The note he sent back was brief and firm, stating that personal relationships not of a criminal nature were no basis for professional evaluation, and that Miss Beckett's record was exemplary. Briggs made no further moves. The warning from the territorial authority had done its work. He moved his attentions, word came eventually, to a land purchase further north, and the slow pressure on the small ranchers east of Dusty Creek eased and eventually stopped. October arrived clean and golden, the first cold edge in the air, the cottonwood trees turning the yellow that matched those small wildflowers along the road, which she had decided she was always going to call Buffalo Burr regardless of what the proper name was, because that was the name she had first learned them by, and the name carried its own set of memories now. Frances Beckett married Dexter Thatcher on the 14th day of October, 1878, in the small church on the west side of Dusty Creek, which was so full of people that several guests had to stand in the doorway and several more in the churchyard outside, all of them peering in with good-humored determination. James Beckett came from St. Louis, could not afford the journey, but sent a letter that made the entire Beckett portion of the congregation laugh. Mrs. Calloway cried throughout and made no attempt to hide it. George Prout, in his best suit, gave Frances away when she asked him, on the grounds that someone should, and she liked him enormously, and he did it with gruff dignity and slightly watery eyes. The minister was a cheerful man named Reverend Paul, who had seen a good many weddings and could tell at 20 yards which ones would last, and he said the words with extra feeling. Dexter stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had never seen him wear before. He had bought it in Abilene, she learned later, because he wanted something right, and watched her come down the aisle with an expression on his face that she felt all the way down to her bones. It was the expression of a man who had held himself carefully together through a great deal and was, for this moment, not holding back at all. She took his hands at the front of the church and looked at him and thought, with the clarity of absolute certainty, that she had made the right choice when she had stepped off that stagecoach in Dusty Creek. Every step of it, every single one. They exchanged rings, simple bands, silver, bought from the jeweler in Abilene who had looked at Dexter's careful budget and been generous about it. And Reverend Paul said the final words, and Dexter kissed her with proper feeling in front of the whole crowded church, which produced a sound that might most accurately be described as a roar from the gathered townspeople, and Mrs. Calloway wept openly and without apology. The celebration afterward was in the town square, with food contributed by seemingly every household in Dusty Creek, because that was the nature of the town, this communal impulse to mark things properly. There was music, a fiddle player named Joaquin Reyes who played with enormous joy, and a man with a mouth organ who played less skillfully but with equal enthusiasm and dancing, and the kind of conversation that happens when everyone present is genuinely glad for the same thing. Dexter danced with her. He was not, he had warned her, a gifted dancer, and this was accurate, but he was earnest about it, and she did not care at all about the precision, only about his hands and the way he held her, one hand warm at her waist, and the look in his eyes across the small distance between them, which was the look she had come to know as exclusively hers. "How are you?" he asked, which was perhaps not the most poetic thing a man had ever said to his bride while dancing, but it was so completely characteristic of him, this practical attentiveness to whether she was all right, that she loved him more rather than less for it. "I am completely, entirely happy," she said. He smiled, the full one, the one she had been collecting since May. "Good," he said. "Me too." They rode out to the ranch that evening in the wagon, and the Texas sky was enormous above them, thick with stars, and he had lit lamps in the house in advance so it was warm and welcoming when they arrived. He had also, she discovered, put new curtains in the bedroom and a vase of buffalo burr. Well, she was calling it that, on the kitchen table, and she did not cry because she was a practical woman, but it was a near thing. The ranch became home with a naturalness that surprised her in its lack of difficulty. She had imagined an adjustment, some period of strangeness, but the place had already been familiar from her Saturday visits, and living in it was simply more of the same good light in the mornings, the same sounds of cattle and wind and Dexter moving about the yard in the early hours before she was quite awake. She still rode to town for school 5 days a week. He would saddle her horse in the mornings. She was a competent rider now. She had worked at it. And she would ride the 4 miles into Dusty Creek in the early light, which was some of the most beautiful light she had ever seen, the land going gold and rose and pale blue all at once, the shadows long and soft. The schoolhouse was hers entirely now, an extension of herself she had made with her own intelligence and patience and care over the months of autumn, and her 17 students had become, in the way of students with a genuinely committed teacher, something very much like her purpose. Tommy Briggs, whose father had been the source of so much trouble, was still her student. His circumstances at home had not much improved, and she watched over him with the particular attention she gave to children who needed it most, and she saw in him the shape of a person who could be good if shown what that looked like consistently. She showed him, every day, and tried not to be angry on his behalf, though she was. She wrote to the county superintendent again in November about getting additional books for the school. He sent half of what she asked for, which she took as a starting point. She wrote again in January. She had every intention of continuing to write until she got what her students needed. Winter came to the Texas plain in December, the silver sharp-edged kind Dexter had described, and she understood now what he had meant, the way the light changed and everything became defined and crystalline and harder. She understood also why he loved this land, the way it demanded attention to every season, the way it gave so much if you paid it the right kind of respect. They spent Christmas quietly, just the two of them at the ranch, with a letter from James and a package from Will that contained a book of poetry and a note saying he planned to visit in the spring. Mrs. Calloway came out for Christmas Day and brought a ham and ate with them around the table in the kitchen. And after supper, she sat in the chair by the stove and fell asleep so peacefully that they let her stay the night, and she woke up cheerful about the whole thing. Frances had something to tell Dexter, and she told him on the evening after Christmas, when Mrs. Calloway had been driven back to town in the wagon, and they were alone again with the stove burning, and the wind moving out across the plain in the dark. She told him simply, directly, the way she did everything. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. "In the summer, I think." He was very still for a moment, in the way he went still when something mattered enough to require all of his attention. Then he put down the book he had been holding and looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, everything in it visible at once, the love and the gratitude and something very deep and quiet that she thought might be wonder. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room and held her very carefully, his arms around her, his face against her hair, and she felt the deliberateness of it, the specific tenderness, and she put her arms around him too, and they stood for a while in the warm kitchen while the winter wind moved outside and the stove ticked and clicked, and the whole world was very quiet and very good. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was a reversal of the usual direction of the question. "More than I can tell you," he said, into her hair. "More than I know how to say." She believed him, she always did. January and February were the quiet months, the months of reading and letters and long evenings by the stove, and Frances found them unexpectedly beautiful. She had not known how to be still before she came to Texas. In St. Louis there had always been something to do, always movement and noise and obligation. The quiet of the ranch in winter was a different thing, not absence but fullness, and she settled into it with a sense of having arrived somewhere she had been heading for a long time. The land dispute, which had seemed so consuming in the summer and autumn, had by now faded to a resolved thing. Briggs had moved his interests northward, and the fence lines were intact, and the small ranchers east of Dusty Creek went about their business without harassment, which was the natural state of things when large interests did not decide to disrupt it. Frances held onto the knowledge of what had happened, the documentation and the letters, and the formal response, as a lesson in the right kind of persistence, the kind that builds walls with paper rather than breaks them with force. Spring returned to Dusty Creek in March, and with it Will Beckett, who was 18 now and taller than James, and who arrived on the stagecoach with enormous energy and a scent. Louis' newspaper he had saved for the journey and immediately made himself indispensable around the ranch, because he was the kind of young man who could not watch work being done without joining it. He stayed for 3 weeks. He followed Dexter around the ranch with the unbounded curiosity of someone encountering a completely different life and asked questions ceaselessly. And Dexter answered everyone with patient precision. And by the end of the first week, Will had announced that he thought ranching was possibly the best occupation he had ever encountered. Dexter, to his enormous credit, did not point out that Will had been doing it for approximately 6 days, but simply said it was good work and required a lot of learning. Frances watched the two of them working together one afternoon from the kitchen window, her brother and her husband. Will gesturing broadly about something and Dexter listening with that characteristic still attentiveness. And she felt something that she thought was the particular happiness of a person whose lives, the one before and the one now, have joined together properly. She taught through the spring with her growing shape, an acknowledged and unremarkable fact in the life of the school, because the children of Dusty Creek were sensible and matter-of-fact about the realities of life in the way that children are when they are not shielded from everything, and they simply incorporated the coming of Miss Beckett's child. They continued to call her Miss Beckett from habit, and she let them. It mattered very little into the general landscape of the school year with minimal fuss. June arrived and Frances finished the school year on a Friday afternoon with the ceremony of it. A small end-of-year gathering of students and their families in the schoolyard, where she spoke briefly and directly about what she was proud of this year. And the families brought food, and the children ran, and Dexter stood at the edge of the gathering watching her, with the look he had that was just for her. She was very near her time in June, and on the 15th day of it, a Saturday when Dexter had been in the south pasture since before dawn, she woke with the understanding that today was the day. She sent word to him with the hand who came in for the midday meal, and by the time the doctor arrived from town and Mrs. Calloway was there. Mrs. Calloway had been planning for this since February and had an entire kit prepared. Dexter was there too, sitting outside the bedroom door because that was where he was permitted to be and in no danger of going anywhere else. The birth was long and not easy, in the way that first births often are, and Frances worked through it with the same determination she brought to everything. And when it was done, the doctor placed in her arms a boy, a solid, healthy boy with dark hair like his father's and lungs that communicated their opinions at considerable volume. She heard Dexter allowed in before she saw him, and then he was beside her, still in his range clothes and smelling of grass and leather and the afternoon sun, and he looked at the child in her arms with an expression she had no word for, only the feeling of it, which was the largest and most complete feeling she had ever been in the room with. A boy, she told him, which was redundant because he could see, but she wanted to say it. A boy, he agreed, and reached out one careful hand and touched his son's face with a fingertip very softly. Samuel, she said. It was the name they had chosen from his father's middle name and her grandfather's first. Samuel John Thatcher. Samuel, Dexter said, and she saw him swallow. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife and then at his son again, and he said, very quietly, "Thank you." She reached out and took his hand, the same motion she had made in so many different moments since she had known him, a motion that had become one of the languages of their life together. He held it, as he always did. Mrs. Calloway, who had been discreetly occupied with tidying in the corner, sniffed loudly and announced that she was going to make coffee, which was her solution to everything, and stepped out. The doctor followed with professional tact. And they were three, in the June afternoon, in the ranch that had been built by one generation and was being built further by another, on the Texas plain that stretched away in every direction under the enormous and indifferent and somehow deeply personal sky. The summer of 1879 passed in the particular fullness of new parenthood, which is simultaneously exhausting and revelatory, the way the presence of a child recalibrates everything around it without diminishing anything. Frances returned to teaching in September, with Samuel at 5 months, a cheerful and substantial presence, who spent his school days in the care of a young woman named Rosa, the daughter of the blacksmith, who had grown up with younger siblings and handled the baby with total competence and some affection. Dexter expanded the herd carefully over that year and the next, making strategic purchases when the prices were right, improving his water access now that the fence situation had been fully resolved, and the ranch grew in a way that felt organic and earned. He hired 2 additional hands, brothers named Pete and Carl Harmon from Arkansas, and they proved reliable and good-natured, and the ranch settled into a productive rhythm. Frances wrote to the school board 4 more times over the following year. She received additional books, a new stove, and eventually a second teacher when enrollment grew past 20 students. She trained the second teacher herself, a young woman from San Antonio named Miss Elena Varga, who was 20 years old and nervous and very intelligent. And Frances was patient and specific with her, and watched her find her footing over the course of the autumn the same way she had found her own. Samuel Thatcher walked at 11 months, which the doctor said was early, and talked at 14 months, which Frances said was perfectly timed, and by the age of 2 was demonstrating a specific and opinionated curiosity about everything within reach that his father met with the same patient explanatory attention he gave to every question, which Frances found so wholly characteristic, and so right that she could not help smiling each time she witnessed it. The spring of 1881 brought a letter from James that he was coming west, not just for a visit but to settle. He had found opportunity in the printing business, he said, and thought Abilene might be the place. And while Abilene was 2 days' ride from Dusty Creek, it was the same world, the same sky, and they would be close. Will had finished his schooling in St. Louis and was making his own way, working for the railroad now, sending letters from different places each month. James arrived in April, and Frances rode to Abilene to meet him, Dexter beside her, Samuel in front of her on the saddle in the manner of small children who consider a horse a perfectly natural seat. James had grown into a solid and cheerful man of 26, and he and Dexter took to each other with the ease of people who share a fundamental set of values about work and honesty and what matters. They stayed 2 days in Abilene and then rode back to the ranch in the April warmth with the plain green all around them and the sky doing its enormous thing above. And Samuel fell asleep against Frances's chest on the ride home, heavy and trusting, and she thought of everything that had been required to arrive at this specific moment, the courage of the journey and the strangeness of the beginning and the long good work of building something real. "What are you thinking?" Dexter asked, riding alongside her. "That I am glad I stepped off that stagecoach," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, then reached across the space between the horses and took her hand briefly, squeezing it once. "So am I," he said, "every day." The autumn of 1881 brought another announcement in the quiet way Frances made important announcements, and this time Dexter had apparently been anticipating something of the kind, because his expression shifted not to surprise but to something deeply satisfied. "Another child, a spring baby this time. Are you hoping for something?" she asked him, the way she had asked with Samuel. "A healthy child," he said without hesitation, "and you well at the end of it. That's the whole of it." She believed him entirely. The baby born in April of 1882 was a girl, dark-haired like her brother, with her mother's very direct gaze, already apparent at 2 days old. They named her Clara Rose Clara for the Prout girl who had been Frances's first star reader, and Rose because Frances had always loved roses and had planted some along the south wall of the ranch house the previous summer, and Dexter had built the trellis for them without being asked. Samuel, who was 2.5 and had been gravely informed of the impending addition to the household, viewed Clara with the mixture of wariness and fascination appropriate to someone encountering a new category of existence. Within a week, he had decided she was interesting. Within a month, he was sitting beside her basket for long, serious periods, talking to her in the manner of a person with important things to convey. Dexter watched this from the doorway of the kitchen one afternoon and turned to Frances with an expression of such pure quiet happiness that she came and stood beside him and they watched together, their son telling their daughter something important about horses, their daughter regarding him with her intent and unfocused gaze. "I did not know it would be like this," Dexter said. "Like what?" he considered. "This full," he said. She put her arm through his, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the doorway of the ranch house on a spring afternoon in Texas, while the land stretched away golden and vast all around them, and the house held its warmth and its noise and its people. And the life they had made together, made from a near collision on a dusty street, and two people paying each other real attention and a decision, made slowly and then all at once, to choose each other, was present in every particular of it. George Prout came to visit them that summer for Sunday dinner, older now and moving more slowly but still sharp and warm. He sat at their table and ate Mrs. Calloway's pot roast recipe, which Frances had learned by now, and held Clara on his knee with practiced ease and talked about the changes in the county, the new businesses coming in, the railroad expanding, the way the town was growing. "It's different than when I first came here," he said. "Even different from 5 years ago. Things change." "Some things," Frances said, refilling his coffee. He looked at her and then at Dexter and then around the kitchen, at the lamps and the books on the shelf and the sound of Samuel playing in the next room, and Clara settled peacefully in the crook of his arm. "Not the ones that count," he said, with the satisfaction of a man who has seen enough to know which things those are. They rode back to town that afternoon, Frances and Dexter and the children, and the Dusty Creek skyline was familiar now in the way that only the places you love become familiar, with every particular of it absorbed and carrying memory. The schoolhouse, the dry goods store, Mrs. Calloway's house with its lace curtains. The spot in the road where she had nearly been run down by a horse on the first day of her new life. "You know," she said to Dexter as they passed that spot, "I think about that first day sometimes." "Do you?" "I think about how completely I did not know what was coming," she said. "All of it. You, the ranch, the children, this life. None of it was in any plan I had made." "And?" he asked. She looked at him across the seat of the wagon. He was the same man she had met on that day, the same careful eyes, the same measured manner, the same quality of attention that she had found striking even then, before she had the language for what she was noticing. And he was also entirely different, made part of her in a way that had changed the shape of things so thoroughly she could no longer quite recall what the outline had been before. "And I am grateful," she said, "for every unpredicted thing." He reached across and took her hand, the same motion worn smooth with use, the most familiar gesture in her life. Samuel was asleep in the back of the wagon with his head on a rolled blanket, and Clara was in the basket between them, making small, peaceful sounds. The cottonwood trees along the road were turning gold in the September afternoon, and the sky was the particular deep afternoon blue that she had first seen when she stepped off the stagecoach with her 2 bags and her teaching certificate and her life still mostly ahead of her. "So am I," Dexter said. "Everything I didn't plan for turned out to be the whole of it." Dusty Creek grew steadily through the remaining years of the decade, and with it the school grew, and Frances grew into her work the way a person grows into something genuinely theirs over time, adding depth and confidence, and the particular wisdom that comes from doing the same right thing repeatedly, until it is very right indeed. The school had 3 teachers by 1884, all of them trained partly by Frances, and a proper new schoolhouse with 4 rooms and enough books, finally, to go around. Dexter's ranch grew too, measured and careful, always within what the land could sustain. He was known in the county as a fair man and a straight one, someone whose word meant what it said, and when disputes arose among the smaller ranchers, he was often the one asked to mediate, because he understood that most disagreements had more to do with fear than malice and needed speaking plainly to rather than fighting. Samuel Thatcher turned 5 and started school in the fall of 1884, walking into the Dusty Creek schoolhouse in his best boots with his father's straight posture and his mother's direct expression. And Frances, who did not teach his class because that would have been impossibly complicated for both of them, watched him from down the hallway on the first morning and felt the particular circular rightness of it, the child in the schoolhouse she had made her own. Clara, 2 years behind him, would follow. And perhaps there would be others. The future of the Thatcher ranch and the Thatcher family felt, as Frances considered it on a warm October evening in 1884, like something open and continuing in the best possible sense, not unresolved but growing, the way things that are truly alive always are. Dexter found her on the porch that evening, as he often did when she had gone quiet, coming to find her the way he always had, with that unerring sense for where she was. He sat down beside her in the second chair. She had made him build a second chair for the porch 2 years ago because she was tired of him leaning against the railing and looked out at the same view she was looking at, the land going gold in the late light, the cattle in the distance, the sky going its slow show above everything. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future," she said. "Ours specifically. And what does it look like?" She turned to look at him. This man who had caught her when she stumbled, who had learned her honestly, who had told her important truths in plain language and listened to hers with complete attention, who had built a life with her out of intention and work and the particular commitment of two people who knew what they were choosing. The evening light was gold on his face and silver in the hair at his temples, and he was looking at her with the same green eyes that had stopped her breath on the very first day, still doing the same thing 6 years later and not likely to stop. "It looks like this," she said. "Exactly like this, only more of it." He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her palm up the way she always did, and he held it the way he always did, and the evening deepened around them, warm and vast and full of the particular generous piece of a life that has been built right. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the fence line. Inside the house, Samuel was loudly explaining something to Clara, who was patiently telling him he was wrong. The ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, the cattle and the wind and the land making its own slow conversation, with the stars coming out one by one above the Texas plain, the same stars he had taught her to navigate by, the practical ones and the romantic ones and the ones that were both. Frances Beckett Thatcher sat on her porch in the October evening with her husband's hand warm in hers, and her children's voices bright in the house behind her, and the whole good particular life they had made together present in every direction she looked. And she thought, as she sometimes still thought, of the moment she had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, with her bags and her certificate and her heart open and her future entirely unwritten. She would not change a single word of what had been written since, not one.